When I was a kid, I loved playing split screen games with my friends, so I always recommend that when someone is making a multiplayer game, they build in split screen. Let me show you how. It's actually a lot easier than you think. So just to get technical stuff out of the way, I'm using Fishnet Networking as a networking solution, and I've been using Easy Character Movement 2 as a base character controller for a while now. I'll put links in the description to both of those assets should you want to check them out. Also, I haven't introduced myself. Hi, I'm Frank. I make games. I've been working on a first-person sword combat game called Castle Wars, which is a working title, for a while now. This is the second prototype of the game. I just made videos on the basic networking setup and a very basic networked lobby. If you want to see how I made those, go check links in the description as well. The next few videos are going to be on advanced FPS movement, like dashing and sliding and swimming and flying, or stuff like walking on a planet so you walk around it. Get subscribed if you want to see how that ends up. Anyways, let's get into it. Updates from last time. I built a map which is currently called Creation, and it should look familiar to some people. I also brought back a map I called the Training Ground, which you'll recognize from the previous prototype of the game if you've been following it. This is just going to be for testing all of our movement capabilities. It will eventually be turned into some sort of like single player experience. Each of these maps also have spawn points with team assignments which get loaded in to our network game director, so we can assign each player a spawn point depending on what team they are on. And I made a button which brings us directly to the training ground, which is quicker than setting up multiple clients and connecting them manually, and will help us really easily test split screen today. Okay, so I already have a way of assigning controllers to local players, and check out Devlog 4 if you want to see how that's done. In our lobby, we have our clients, and underneath each client, we have instantiated a client local player for each local player. And that client local player object is going to store our team assignments, and they will be parent objects for the actual player pawns that we're going to spawn later. Okay, now for the fun part. For each of our local players, we're going to spawn a pawn. These pawns are going to be what the players control. Pawns will contain all of the simulation rules for the players. We're going to need some way of actually controlling these pawns. I built a player driver component, which is where our input processing is going to happen, and this is also where we're later going to implement client-side prediction. Get subscribed for that. The driver is a collection of references and input callbacks which interfaces with the pawn. For example, if we call this onJump function, using the callback context, we set a jump variable to true or false, and similarly we can call this onMovement function with a callback context, and it will save our movement vector. Storing input like this kind of seems dumb when you first look at it. Like, we already have some sort of signal to make it happen. Why don't we just send that automatically to the player? This is sort of future-proofing ourselves so we can build in client-side prediction and server authenticated movement. We're going to need to send input packets from the clients to the server so that the server can run its own simulation and make sure that everything is accurate. It looks dumb, but just trust me on this one. Then we have a simulate function which gets called at a set interval, and it's going to use the current state of the player as well as the inputs that we've collected to move the player according to all of those simulation rules that we set up on the pawn. And it'll do that just by calling functions. So all of this is great, and it would be working if we were actually calling these on something functions. We could just create a player input component from the new Unity input system for each player and then just connect those to our player drivers. But then what happens for a remote player? We don't need to control them, we just need to see their pawns move. So to handle actually driving the player, I created a local player driver component, and this has replicas of all of our on something functions that we have in the player driver, and it has a variable which points to our player driver. So this local player driver component, it can be put on our prefab with a player input component, and the player input component can call functions on the local player driver. And then once we spawn the local player driver, we can just give it a reference to our player driver, and that way it can interface with the player pawn. But we only need to spawn these local player drivers for each of the local players, hence the name. Now we can move all of our local players around. Similarly, we're going to need to spawn first-person cameras only on the local players, since we're only going to ever need to render from the local players' perspectives. I know we might want kill cams later down the line, but worst case, we just take a camera stack and stick that onto a remote player for some period of time. We don't need those to always be on all of the players. I spawn a camera stack on all the local players and attach it to the eyes of those players, which is what's going to get moved around by mouse or controller input. The camera stack renders UI on top of weapons, on top of world space UI, on top of everything else. And we also call a component on the game manager, which when given a player ID will give us camera recs for the quadrants of the screen. I say quadrants, but it'll know how many players we have because it's on the game manager, and it will be like, okay, you have 2 players, so 1 and 2, or 3, 1, 2, 3. It's pretty simple. That's split screen. Now when we load in, all the camera recs get set, and it just kind of works. So look at that. It's a lot of startup work, but ultimately it's not too hard. Because of how we built it, we can still connect to remote lobbies and use multiple local players. So now let's just do a couple of polish things now that we have the players spawning and walking around. First, I added a component to the player visual, which checks the player's team assignment and then sets the color of the capsule to either red or blue so we can differentiate who's on what team. And second, I added name tags which hover over each player's head, and they rotate each frame to the face of the player that is currently rendering. Those are really quick though, and honestly that's all I really got for today. The split screen really is not that hard if you build it early. If you try and build it after all the player stuff is set up, it's god awfully hard. Just trust me, don't do that. Build it first. Anyways, I'm gonna call it there. A little note, I'm not going to be using copyrighted music anymore in these videos. There's so many songs that I really want to use, but I'm worried that if this gets anywhere close to a product that I'm going to release, these videos are not only going to act as documentation of progress, but also as promotional material, and I don't really want to risk using music that I don't have a license to in what is possibly accidentally promotional material. Yeah, on that note, next time I'm going to be building advanced movement capabilities, so get subscribed, and if you liked the video, like it. If you didn't, I really don't know why you're still here. Comment if you have any questions, music recommendations, comments about how many times I fixed my hair during this video. You know the drill. Oh, and download my games, Poke My Balls, Launch My Dog on iOS and Google Play. Go try them. I bet you'll have fun. Alright, I'll see you next time.